Our gospel reading for today is from Luke 21, verses 5 through 19. As history moved towards God's fulfillment, there will be frightening signs and events. Before the end, believers will draw strength from their relationship to God and shall be given the words they need to testify and to endure without fear. When some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God, Jesus said, "As for these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." They asked him, "Teacher, when will this be? And what will the sign that this is about to take place?" And he said, "Beware that you are not led astray. For many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and 'The time is near.' Do not go after them. When you hear of wars and insurrections, do not be terrified. For these things must take place first, but the end will not follow immediately." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, and in various places famines and plagues. And there will be dreadful portents and great signs from heaven. But before all this occurs, they will arrest you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors because of my name. This will give you an opportunity to testify. So, make up your minds not to prepare your defense in advance, for I will give you words and a wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, by relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, but not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance you will gain your souls." Here ends the reading. And good morning. Yes, be seated, please. As I read and reread the scriptures for today, the 23rd Sunday after Pentecost, I found myself really struggling to try and find a sermon message in all of those texts. I had to look up Pentecost one more time to find out, just what that was about again. And in rereading that, it was 50 days after Passover. And it was also called the Festival of Harvest. So that's one of the major Jewish festivals. We celebrate in about a week and a half our Festival of Harvest, Thanksgiving. Back to the readings. In the Malachi 4 reading, it talks about the day of judgment and the wicked and arrogant being burned up like straw. Is this anything like the terrible wildfires that were burning in California a couple weeks ago? Or now down in Australia? Then again, in the 98th Psalm reading, it ends with a judge announcement that tells us that the Lord is coming to judge the earth with justice. Now, some might believe that our floods and hurricanes and other natural disasters are all part of a judgment, and therefore the end is near. Should we abandon our normal work and daily tasks to wait for that second coming? I had a friend in Detroit Lakes who sang with a barbershop chorus that I sang with. Some time ago, he decided that he was no longer going to work. He quit his beautiful job at a pharmacy and went to live on a commune over in Becker County. I'm not sure if Armageddon was his thinking, but he did quit his job and he joined that communal. I'm not a member of that line of thinking. Also, I'm pretty sure that the tornado that hit our small homestead north of Hawley in 1975, and the one that went the Rabbit Lake tornado, and I think it was 1988, was not a message from God that the end was near. Those are kind of natural occurring things. Now, in Paul's second letter to the Thessalonians, he wrote to encourage those facing persecution and told them to not sit idly by waiting for Christ's return. Instead, he told them to make the most of their time and talent and never tire of doing good. And I smile when I think of all those in this church community that make the most of their time and talent and continually do good, whether that's the Salem West or the jail ministry or the Mustard Seed, Habitat for Humanity, and the list goes on and on. Finally, in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus talks about the future in a time of great persecution. Believers will be betrayed by parents, brothers, relatives, friends, hated and persecuted for being a believer. Wow, that's some scary stuff. I wasn't real anxious to find a sermon message in that text either. So, not finding any inspiration for that sermon message in any of the four texts, I decided just to say a little bit about my faith journey in the events in my life that brought me to Salem Lutheran of Deerwood, and the prayer life that was involved. Born in 1945, the second of the 11 children, it was a little tough. I grew up pretty much poor. Who would have known now that, or then, that patched blue jeans would be modern and in style today? Rips and tears and everything. I remember my mother doing the best she could to try and mend a patch when I was little and I wore my church clothes outside and got a tear in them or something. Wow. Anyway, living in a log house that had a wood stove for heat. In the morning, the frost on your face and hair would be quite evident, sleeping 4 in a bed with 3 brothers. It was a pretty tough life. You know, I waited for somebody to shake that grate thing in the wood stove to get the ashes down and start a new fire in the morning. Frost, frozen water in the sink, that kind of stuff. Well, after my birth, my mom had 9 more kids in the next 13 years. And that many children to clothe, feed, and provide for was a little bit much for my dad, and he left for another woman. Believe that. I was 15, and I was the oldest at home at the time. My older brother was 18, and he'd moved out and married. Now the court said that my mom would get $6.25 a week per child. I remember she showed me that first check, $62.50 for 1 week to take care of herself, 10 kids, house, car, whatever. We did get to keep the log house and the 80 acres we lived on. One of the prayers that my mother had one time of the year, it was about this time of the year, that she prayed that, you know, we'd have a decent meal for Thanksgiving. We couldn't afford to, go and have a turkey and pie and all that good stuff. And just before Thanksgiving, a neighbor showed up with a package of a turkey, a pie, an apple pie, and all the trimmings. And I thought, that's an answer to prayer. That really was. And for our family, that was kind of a happy meal. Anyway, I can remember that quite well. I also remember reading a magazine and an article. I was sitting on my bed upstairs, and here's this kind of like a trooper or Mountie kind of figure dressed in red and black with a trooper hat. And it said, North American School of Conservation. So you want to become one of these officers, just send into this thing and we'll get you through this School of Conservation. Well, I did. They wrote back and said, you got to be 18 before you come. So that 14-year-old, it wasn't going to work. All right, well, one thing my father did do for us boys was to get us jobs in construction. We all worked for probably under him, and he was a general, not a general, but he was a foreman for a big construction company. And I worked as a laborer for one summer. Then in the fall of 1963, my neighbor said, let's go out to Washington and work for Boeing's. Oh, that's kind of like a dream come true. I can get away from everything here and go work for Boeing's. So we did. We drove out to Washington, went to work for Boeing Aircraft Corporation in 1963. I got homesick and was back again in the spring of 1964. I couldn't live that kind of life away from family. Anyway, I went back to the construction job. In 1965, I was offered a job as an apprentice bricklayer. I took that job. Later in 1965, I was drafted by the Uncle Sam. He said, I got the letter. Uncle Sam wants you reported to Fargo and then on to Kansas City and then over to Fort Riley, Kansas, where I took basic training in January and February of 1966, January, February. I remember it was cold as the blazes down there in those Kansas prairies, and I had a distinct advantage from a lot of the other kids that were drafted. They came from southern places, and they really suffered. I was told by a number of people, never raise your hand for anything when you're in the military. Don't volunteer for anything. But one day we're going to go on our first forced march. It's like a 25-mile march. They asked, anybody here ever had frostbite? I raised my hand. Oh, I knew I shouldn't have done that. You, over here. So I went over there. They wrapped a white armband around my fatigue jacket. What is that for? I don't know. But we started out. A quarter mile later, up drives a Jeep. Jump in, Private. What? Jump in. Okay. So I jumped in and I rode for a quarter mile, warmed up, jumped out, quarter mile back in the Jeep. The Army was taking care of me, I guess. That was an answer to prayers. Anyway, after boot camp, I went to AIT, Advanced Individual Training, in Fort Gordon, Georgia, where I learned to be a teletype operator. And that was all new to me. Teletype at that time was a way they could communicate in the military, I guess. So, coming back to Fort Riley, and then I got shipped over to South Vietnam, where I spent 1 year as a teletype, well, mostly as a teletype operator, out in the jungle with my little van and sandbagged up over the sides and over the top so that the mortars wouldn't get me. There were some prayers going up then. And, you know, you don't never know if their prayers are answered right away, but here I am. When I got back, my younger brother, Dean, had been drafted as well, and he was waiting his turn to go. They didn't want to send two brothers at the same time to Vietnam for fear that they would both be killed, and the parents would be very sad. Anyway, when I got back, I met Dean, and he introduced me to a beautiful woman who later became my wife, and she sits out there, beautiful, yes. A few months later, I married Becky against the wishes of her parents. We had a big church wedding. There was only about 7 people in that church, but it was a big church up in Bemidji where she was going to college. Reverend Mark Whitmer talked about the rings that we exchanged. It was a circle, unbroken circle of love, he said, and let your love remain unbroken. Still poor, but I had $20 in my pocket, or we had $20 at that time. So I gave the minister the $20, not knowing what we were going to do for food for the next week. What'd the minister do? Mark Whitmer, bless his soul, turned around and gave me the $20 back and said, this is my wedding present to you two. Another answer to prayer. When I think back, man, did the Lord work in answered prayers many, many different ways for us. Early in our marriage, we purchased a 7-acre farmstead near Hitterdal, where we were surrounded by Lutherans. We really didn't have any choice. It was the thing to do. You joined the church. And as it happened to be, that was Salem Lutheran Church of Hitterdal. Salem Lutheran Church of Hitterdal. What a coincidence. Before I could join, the pastor asked us if we'd been confirmed and all that. Well, I was a confirmation dropout. The pastor, we read for the minister, that's how they called it, read for the minister at the parsonage. And I was so embarrassed I didn't take my shoes off because I had holes in my stockings. Like I said, growing up poor. They were clean stockings, but they had holes in them, and I didn't want to take my shoes off, and consequently, he scolded me something fierce, and I just left. I walked 5 miles home. I'm done with that confirmation stuff. So the new pastor in Hitterdal had compassion on me. He took me aside, sat me down, and asked me what I knew about this, that, and another thing in the Bible. And I guess I must have passed because we were allowed to join the church. That Salem church was a beautiful place, and it still is today. Well, I spent the next few years as a hard-working bricklayer. Always in the back of my mind was this thought about, I really wanted to be a game warden or whatever. The people I worked with, they were hard-living people, hard drinking, hard talking. And I finally just, one day I couldn't stand it anymore. It was on a Friday. I came home. I told my wife, I told Becky, I said, I quit. I can't stand, listening to all that conversation. And I'll admit, when I was in Vietnam, I was coarse. I used some coarse language. But this, I'm getting more Salem influence in me, and I couldn't stand it anymore. I told her I quit. You did what? I quit my job. I can't stand it. I don't know what we're going to do, but I quit. Saturday morning, phone rang. A gentleman called Vince Haugen. He was a Christian contractor, bricklayer contractor. He just hired bricklayers. He wasn't a general contractor, just bricklayers. Understand you're looking for a job. And that's where I worked the rest of my day until one, I don't remember what it was, probably a Saturday. I was out fishing and with my brother-in-law, and Becky and her sister were visiting on shore at the public access because the boat wasn't real big for 4 people. So along came a game warden, and she's right away telling him, my husband always wanted to be one of you guys. And he said, well, there's a civil service test that's going to be given, whatever, next week or 2 weeks. That's what he's got to do, take that civil service test. So I took that civil service test, along with 3,000 other individuals in Minnesota. There was 2 job openings. And I thought, well, a week later I got an announcement saying that I passed that test along with 2,000 other people. So now, well, the odds are really getting better. It's 2 out of 2,000. During the course of the year, in 1979 through the middle of 1980, I took a number of tests. And after every one, I came home just sad because I knew I must have flunked it. And every one they told me, you passed, you passed, you passed. Got to down to probably 50 or 100 people. The legislature had met in session, I don't know, it was February, March, whatever. They passed in a bill for additional 15 wardens. Whoa, now there's 17 openings. I'm in good stead now. So I was working down in Marshall, and I had been told that I needed to go to some place in the Minneapolis-St. Paul for a physical. The night before I went for this physical, I got a sty in my eye. Never before and never since have I ever had a sty. It's like a big pimple behind your eyelid. And I got to the point where I could hardly see. My eye was mattering and running, and I couldn't hardly see. And I thought, why me, Lord? The day before I have to take an eye test. So I prayed, and I prayed, and I prayed. Next morning I wake up, I still have this sty in my eye. It's just killing me. It's my left eye. And all the way to the city, I prayed. And halfway there, I felt this thing burst, and it was running down my eye and blinking, and I can see again. The pain is gone. My eye has been healed. Thank you, Lord. I got to the eye test. The test was over, and the person said, you have some very impaired vision in your right eye. What? I said, how can that be? I had a sty in my left eye, and that's the one I thought would be the problem. You had a what? I said, I had a sty in my left eye. How long? Well, all day yesterday and all morning. I said, till whatever. Oh, that explains it. You've overworked your right eye. That explains why it's not working so well. I'll pass you. Oh, thank God. So on to the hearing test. At the hearing test. Now this is my lifelong dream. Take the hearing test. I think I did really well. Got to the analyst and she says, you have some pretty severe hearing loss in your left ear. I don't think we can pass you. What? How can that be? Well, she said, well, wait a minute, she said. When did you come over to this appointment today? And I said, this morning. I said, how far did you drive? I said, from Marshall. You don't have air conditioning in your car, do you? I said, no, why? You drove with your window down, didn't you? Yeah. She said, you've deadened that one range of tones in your left ear, that's why that whole range of tones is gone. I'll pass you. Oh, answered prayer. What a deal. Anyway, God is good. Yep, and so, where am I? Strength and agility test I took was a breeze. I aced that with, I think I was second out of 50 candidates or something. I had a bounce in my step. I was a bricklayer. I ran all the time, whatever. Then I got to get down to the last 25 people, and they were going to give us a psychological evaluation. If any of you had it, it's called the MMPI, Minnesota Multiphasic Inventory. There's like 1,500 questions. Actually, there's only 2 or 3 questions, but they keep asking the same ones over and over. Do you love your father? Do you hate your father? Whatever, I don't know. Anyway, during that testing period of the 25 people that was there, I was the last one to finish it. But in the time that I was being tested, the state psychologist, John Gunther, called me into his office. And he sat me down, and the chair was like way below the desk like this. And he's up there in a chair like that. And he's not a real big guy, but I mean, it's really intimidating. So he was going through it, and he said, how are you doing? Good. What was your occupation, or what is your occupation? I said, bricklayer. He said, what kind of wages does a bricklayer make nowadays? I said, well, $12.65 an hour. He said, whoa. He said, do you realize that your wage as a game warden would be $6.36 an hour starting? I said, yeah. He said, that wouldn't be a problem for you? I said, well, no. Well, there is, one problem. He said, what's that? I said, I can't find any all green jelly beans. And he looked at me, and he picked up his pencil, and behind his hand he's starting to write. And I said, all green jelly beans. He said, I don't understand. I said, well, I understand if I get hired, I'm going to go out and work somewhere for 10 days and then come home for 4, and then go work somewhere else for 10 and come home for 4. And he said, yeah, that's the way the program works. He said, that's your training, and you do that for 6 months. I said, yeah, that's what I understand. I said, in the past, whenever I've had to work away from home, we try to work 4 10-hour days and come home for 3 days. And I've always brought something home for the kids. Little something, not much. So I thought if I could find green jelly beans, I come home after 10 days, the kids come running out, and what'd you get us, Dad? What'd you get us? And I say, jelly beans, and I throw them all over in the grass, and then I could at least spend a little time with Mom all by herself. And he'd been scribbling frantically behind his hand. And then I said, in brown in the fall, and then white in the winter would get me an hour. Oh. John looked, and he had a real quizzical look on his face. And I can call him by first name because we became pretty good friends. And I leaned back in the chair and raised my hands like I give up. I said, just a little humor, Mr. Gunther, just a little humor. Yeah. Not too long later, John called my wife when I was at work, and he said, do you think Gary would still like the job? She's the one that's going to be giving up everything, all her friends, everything. You bet he would love the job. Well, we're going to offer it to him. So that prayer was answered, and many other prayers were answered on my way to becoming a conservation officer in Worthington, and then transferring to Crosby in 1982. And I've been here ever since, and my family and kids have been raised here. And thanks be to God, I'm here to tell you that story today. So, looking back over the past 70 plus years of my life, there's times when I think that I've been abandoned by God because it didn't seem like things were going my way. But I know that God answers prayers. Some of them take a while to be answered, but he does answer prayers. Amen.